My name is Corey Berg, and I'm an Assistant Director of Academic and Membership Affairs for the D3 team. I've come out of the chat for this presentation, and today I'm joined by Bill Regan, who's our Division 3 Team Associate Director.
I think Corey's handing it off to me. Thanks, Corey. This is Bill Regan, as Corey's already mentioned, member of the Division 3 team here with the Academic and Membership Affairs. So today, again, welcome. Thank you for joining us to talk about new legislation for 2020. Quick overview of our agenda. What we've done is selected convention proposals. Those are proposals that were adopted at the 2020 convention in January. We've also selected a few non-controversial legislative proposals that Corey will cover, as well as an April 24th, 2020 staff interpretation. We selected these out of all the proposals and interps because we thought that these are ones that either have had a lot of conversation or questions around, or we anticipate that as the year progresses, we'll continue to get more questions. So our hope is to kind of give you just a basic understanding of what's new for the 2020-21 academic year. So the first proposal is the snacks proposal. This was a membership proposal that will become effective August 1, 2020. The intent of this proposal is really to permit institutions to provide their snacks and permissible nutritional supplements to its student athletes. It's a benefit incidental to the student athletes' participation in athletics. Really, this was in response to the question that we're getting a lot from institutions about their desire to be able to fulfill the nutritional needs for its student athletes. So before the change, and this is what you see here, what was the current rule, the rule prior to the change? So before the change, institutions were permitted to provide a student athlete with a meal under really some defined situations that were outlined in the legislation. Examples included you could provide a meal the day of a home athletics contest, or in conjunction with an away from home athletics contest, or during a vacation period when you require your student athlete to remain on campus for practice. Or if a student athlete missed a meal they had already paid for because of practice activities, and when they finished those practice activities, the dining hall itself was closed, or the dining facilities were closed. As for nutritional supplements, those could have only been provided to a student athlete when they have been provided in conjunction with one of the meals I've talked about. An institution could not have provided separate nutritional supplements outside of being provided in conjunction with one of those meals. Here's what the new legislation looks like, and this is actually the text in the new legislation. So I won't read this one necessarily, but I will kind of give you a brief overview. So the new legislation now reads as follows. It permits an institution to provide snacks and permissible nutritional supplements to student athletes for the purposes of providing additional calories or electrolytes. You'll notice what's missing here. We don't really define when you can do it, when you can't do it, or what a snack or a snack and nutritional supplement is. So we're leaving it to the institutions to determine the timing and scope in which to provide this benefit. We don't define snack because it really is up to the institution to determine how best to provide for the nutritional needs of its student athletes. And there's a lot of difficulty in trying to define what's the difference between a snack and a meal, really leaving that up to the institutions to determine based upon the nutritional needs of its student athletes. This proposal also modified a couple of additional pieces of legislation, and those are listed here. These now provide the institution to be able to provide a meal in conjunction with institutional committee service, or when it's related to education or business meetings, provided those activities, those education and business meetings comply with bylaw 16.3. That really is that the service and program for the student athlete is generally available to the institution's student body. And finally, what we have is a chart for you. This chart outlines when it's permissible now, going forward, for your institution to be able to provide a meal to a student athlete or provide a snack. And this chart becomes effective August 1, 2020. couple elements I'd like to highlight is first, in conjunction with practice, you can see that the meal is not provided, but this would be the opportunity where the institution could provide a snack for its student athletes. Additionally, in conjunction with voluntary workouts outside the playing season and any non-traditional practices, again, opportunities that although you can't provide a meal, you could provide a snack for a particular student athlete. Moving on, Proposal 2020-5 is another membership-sponsored proposal. This proposal, you notice, has an immediate effective date, which means that once it was adopted by the membership at the convention in January, it became effective right then. This proposal permits an institution to pay for expenses associated with practice for the sports of golf and swimming and diving outside the current mileage and location limitations. So what did the previous rules state? The previous rules said that for all sports, that an institution could pay for practice expenses for student athletes if the practice occurred in the state where the institution is located, or within 100 miles of the state if the practices will occur outside the state where the institution is located, or if those are practices associated with any away from home competition. So here's the new bylaw, 168115. So the rule now reads that for the sports of golf, swimming, and diving, an institution can provide actual necessary travel expenses. That would be transportation, lodging, and meals for the swimming and diving student athletes and golf that occur at any location during the institution's official vacation period, provided the student athlete is eligible and the student athlete does not miss any class. A few things to keep in mind. A vacation period, that vacation period in which you can provide these expenses must occur during the institution's declared playing season. So for the sports of golf, swimming, and diving, you have declared playing season. If the vacation period occurs within that declared playing season, the institution can use this exception to pay for practice activities at any location. When we say a student athlete must be eligible, we want to clarify that the student athlete must be eligible to compete, not just practice, in order to receive expenses under this exception. Finally, when we say any location, again, what we mean is any location within the continental United States. So those are some additional limits for that particular exception. Tiffany?
Bill, I have one question that actually relates to snacks. So can a student athlete be given money for meals? They actually say meals, but for meals or snacks.
No, the proposal only permits an institution to be able to provide the snack itself. It does not permit an institution to provide the student athlete with cash to purchase the snack.
All right, Bill, I have one more, and it's what was the purpose of this new rule? Why was it changed? And I believe that is related to snacks.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of institutions were asking about the ability to be able to provide snacks. Student athletes very busy. Student athletes are running from practice to class, back to another meeting, and really the institutions were beginning to realize that particular student athletes maybe were having some issues with being able to have enough calories. So what this is now is the ability for the institution to be able to kind of continue to meet the nutritional needs of its student athletes, to really ensure the welfare of its student athletes, and to ensure the institutions have an opportunity to meet the nutritional needs for its student athletes.
Thanks, Bill. I have one more piece of follow-up, that same exact question, but related to golf and swimming and diving. So what was the purpose for the new rule and why was it changed?
Yeah, for swimming and diving. A lot of institutions were finding that when they were planning competitions, so they were going to go on a training trip over a vacation period, had scheduled competitions for those training trips. We're finding a couple things. One, when those competitions were canceled at the very last minute, institutions could no longer be involved in those training activities. One, also, it's difficult in some of these sports to find weather was making it more difficult for some of these sports to be able to practice, to get a meaningful practice and competition opportunities. And finally, there are some questions about the legitimacy of the actual events being conducted. Given all those things, I thought the most flexible approach would be for those particular sports that were listed is to provide the opportunity for them to go on these training trips without the need to have to try to schedule competitions that, one, were maybe not as legitimate as they would have hoped, or two, were somewhat tenuous because institutions may drop out or the teams they were playing may actually have to cancel those particular events. The next proposal is voluntary leadership program. Now, Caitlin and Tiffany covered this if you were in bylaw 17, so I'm not going to spend as much time as they did on this particular proposal, but do want to cover it nevertheless. So this is proposal 2020-6. It was adopted at convention and permits coaches to engage in leadership programming involving sports-related information with their student athletes outside the declared playing season. Prior to this change, student athletes and coaches could engage in leadership and other programming that involves sports-related information outside the playing season, provided similar programming was available to students rather generally. And the activity itself wasn't limited to members of a specific team. And finally, the activity itself was voluntary. This is actually the new legislation. So the new legislation itself now provides an exception to permit a coach to conduct voluntary leadership programming with their team, provided the student athletes are serving in a team leadership capacity, and that is defined by the coach. And the activity itself is voluntary. These leadership programming activities occur during the regular academic year. And they're limited to one meeting per student athlete per team. And there could be no more than one per week for no more than 90 minutes with no more than 10 of these sessions in a given academic year. Finally, the plan and the material for these programming sessions must be on file with the athletic director and the compliance coordinator. Another thing to note that the content can be athletically related content, but it cannot it cannot be content that we would consider to be practice activities. So there can't be any physical activities, there can't be any chalk talks, there can't be strategy, there cannot be film review. The next proposal is Athletics Diversity and Inclusion Designee. This proposal has an effective date of August 1, 2020, and really requires any active Division III institution or conference to identify and designate an athletics diversity and inclusion designee. Now, this person will actually become the primary contact and conduit for diversity and inclusion information that comes into the institution or the conference. A couple of things to remember about this actual proposal. So what is an athletics diversity and inclusion designee? It's a staff member, right? So they have to be a staff member that's appointed by the institution or conference. As I said earlier, it is really for this to provide a point person for information that comes in both at the national and local level, maybe at the campus level, involving issues of diversity and inclusion. Also see this as an individual who will be a promoter of diversity and inclusion practices related to athletics, both at the institutional level and at the campus level. Who can this be? Well, this can be any staff member at the institution or conference. You do not have to hire a new person to fulfill this role. This role can be added to the responsibilities of an existing staff member. How does an institution designate this individual? Well, they'll do it annually through the NCAA Sports Sponsorship and Demographic Form. So, Tiffany, before I move on, are there any questions?
Yes, so there's one question about the leadership programming. What percentage of a team can be deemed leaders, or could a coach designate 100% of their team as leaders to take part in these 10 meetings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we leave that up to the coach to define. So the coach can define leadership, and every student athlete could eventually be defined as a leadership. So you may have my sophomores, I have team leaders. My juniors are team leaders. We leave that up to the coach to define what that means. So yes, it could mean that the whole team is and defined as within a leadership capacity for purposes of this legislation. The one caveat to that is these are intended to be small group meetings. So if you're a team with a large group of student athletes, to say that all of them should be in one meeting would probably be contrary to the intent of the proposal. The proposal is for smaller groups of student athlete leaders to meet with the coach to go over leadership programming. Anything else?
Yeah, I have one more, Bill. Would escape rooms count as a physical activity for leadership activities?
That is a great question. And we would say a ropes course would count. And I believe we've answered this, but I cannot recall the response right now. So I do not want to reply to this. Happy to get the contact information. We can follow up unless one of my other staff members can remember the decision we made.
So I'll chime in. I just reviewed this for our portion of the leadership programming, and we did say that the escape room would be permissible.
Okay.
It wouldn't be considered a physical activity. So if it's provided outside this, yeah, so it would be a permissible leadership activity.
Okay, great. Thank you, Caitlin.
Mm-hmm.
And Bill, I have one related to the athletics diversity and inclusion designee. What are the roles and responsibilities of that newly formed position? What's that responsible for?
We have not listed any specific roles or responsibility. The intent, though, does say that what we'd like this individual to do is to serve as the point person for information. So the hope would be that they would be collecting information that comes in from the NCAA, and they would be disseminating that information to their student athletes and to their campus, as well as receiving maybe information from the local level, their conference. So really they become a point person. Apart from that, we do not have any specific roles and responsibilities. I think that would be up to every institution and or conference to assign.
Another question regarding the athletics diversity inclusion designee is, will there be any continued education or training for that individual?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I do not know the answer to that, but it's something we certainly can bring up with our governance staff.
And one last question on this one, Bill. Who appoints that person?
Yeah, so it would be the conference commissioner, it could be the president of the institution, whoever would be the designation, the individual at the institution who would designate similar positions at the institution. All right, the last two proposals that we'll talk about in this section are proposals concerning two emerging sports that were added. The two emerging sports for women that were added based on the convention's vote were acrobatics and tumbling and wrestling. Those are proposals 2028 and 2029. Both have an August 1, 2020 effective date. So for acrobatics and tumbling, just a few things we wanted to highlight here is it is a spring sport, so it would follow the same calendar you have for your other spring sports. Has a maximum of 12 dates of competition. It's important to note, though, that none of those dates of competition can occur in the non-traditional segment of the playing season. The reason that they're there for that restriction is for safety purposes because of the activities involved in acrobatics and tumbling. The sponsors felt that it would be safest to have all the contests occur during the traditional playing season. For sports sponsorship minimums, these are 6 contests with at least 18 participants. This is a little bit different for Division III because this is a team sport. It is the first team sport that has a minimum number of participants for a contest to count for terms of sports sponsorship requirements. I'll move on to wrestling. Now, wrestling itself is a winter sport. Practice cannot begin until August 10th. That is the same as it exists for men's wrestling. There is a maximum of 16 dates of competition. And again, the first date of competition cannot be before November 1. Sports sponsorship minimums are 7 contests with at least 6 participants. With that, I will pass it off to my friend Corey.
Hey, thanks, Bill. So you may be wondering, Bill just ran through all the convention proposals. What could there be for me to talk about? And the answer is non-controversial legislation. And so before we dive into the pieces that we've picked out today, just want to remind everyone what we mean when something is called non-controversial. So non-controversial legislation it's got a few steps to it. It's adopted first in concept, then staff writes it up for what it's going to look like in the legislation, and then it's ultimately approved in final legislative format by Division III's President's Council or Management Council. And so pieces of non-controversial legislation, they help promote the general function of our division, and once they're adopted by the appropriate council, they become effective immediately. So you may think that's weird, especially because all of the proposals that Bill just ran through were actually voted on by the membership at the business session at convention. And whether or not you know it, the membership also votes on or ratifies all pieces of non-controversial legislation also at the business session. So if you have a 2020 official notice lying around, I'm sure many of you do, head to the blue pages of that little booklet and you'll be able to see all of the non-controversial legislation that was ratified back when we were all together in Anaheim. So let's head into some pieces of legislation. So we're going to start off with this piece of non-controversial legislation that's been approved in concept by Management Council. It's on the slate to be approved in final format at their July meeting, and it'll be ready to go with the start of the 2020-2021 academic year. And so for those of you that tuned in to Bill and Caitlin's Bylaw 14 webinar yesterday, you heard Bill talk a little bit about this already. It's an expansion of the exception to full-time enrollment for a student athlete in their final term. So before this non-controversial legislation, if a student athlete was in the final term of their undergraduate degree enrollment, they could practice or compete while enrolled at less than full-time status if they were carrying whatever they needed to complete their undergraduate degree, if they were carrying for credit those classes that they need to finish off their degree. The key here is the undergrad degree part. The exception did not extend to student athletes who had outstanding credits that were going to complete a minor or undergraduate certificate program. So moving into the 2020-2021 academic year, this final term exception is going to expand. Undergraduate student athletes will be able to participate while enrolled at less than full-time if they're in their final term before graduating and they're carrying for credit the courses they would need to complete a minor or an undergraduate certificate program. Couple of important things to remember. The minor or their certificate program must have been declared prior to the term that the student athlete's going to use the exception. They're not able to just start declaring random minors in order to stick around and participate at less than full-time status. It's got to be something that was established before that final term. Also, if for whatever reason things don't go as planned and they don't end up successfully completing whatever those outstanding requirements were, they will forfeit all future eligibility in all sports. And again, the key here is the word undergraduate. So student athletes who graduate from your institution, they would not be able to access or use this exception once they graduate from your school. All right, so our next piece of non-controversial legislation, all of you have ratified already back in Anaheim, and that is non-controversial legislation 2020-12, mental health resources. So for those of you that have checked out part 1 of the new legislation PowerPoint in the Learning Portal, you're going to recognize a lot of the information on the coming slides. So this first slide ensures that the legislation ensures that student athletes are aware of and have access to mental health resources that your department makes available or your institution's health services or counseling services makes available. This first slide outlines kind of the requirements for this legislation. You've got to make the resources available to the student athletes and make sure that the resources are consistent with the Inter-Association Consensus mental health best practices. In terms of timing, you've got to distribute the resources annually, and you have to let the student athletes know annually that you're providing them with these resources and provide them with a guide to the resources you make available with instructions on how to access them. So very similar to what Bill was talking about with the leadership programming and the who's, the what's, how big can the group be, who can the leadership be, and how all of that is kind of left to the discretion of the institution. The mental health resources, the how of doing the legislation that resulted from this non-controversial proposal is on this slide. A lot of it, again, is up to your institution's discretion. That was kind of on purpose because you know best what's going to be most effective and what's most efficient for you and for your student athlete cohort. So the legislation, which resulted in current bylaw 16.4.1, it doesn't prescribe when you must provide the student athletes with these resources, and it also doesn't limit how many times you can remind them that those resources are available. Within the resources that you provide for them, you can choose which information to include, especially as it pertains to student athlete mental wellness. And then you can also choose the way you distribute your resources to the student athletes. So if social media works best, or using some sort of website or My Playbook or logging into some sort of app, that all works. Or you could even go the old-fashioned route and go with printed materials. All are okay, and like I said, it's up to your institution to decide how to best abide by this legislation. And so before we move on to the next item, I did want to show you a quick snapshot of what LSDBI actually looks like for this non-controversial legislation. A lot of times we hear as staff that LSDBI is not the most user-friendly, so I'm trying to throw a couple of screenshots your way so you know exactly what to put in the search bar and exactly what will pop up once you do that. So if you put 16.4.1 in the search bar, you're going to pull up the three things that you see here on this slide. You're going to see the bylaw itself. You're going to see the proposal that created it, which is that first red circle, and you're going to see an educational column that was put out in September of last year that provides you with some more guidance, some more clarification, some more information on mental health resources and satisfying this newly created bylaw.
Hey, Corey, someone's asked if you wouldn't mind just going back to the last slide real quick to confirm what the resources have to be consistent with.
Yeah, I think that was actually 2 ago, but let me get there. Actually, I don't, oh, yep, here it is. The Inter-Association Consensus Mental Health Best Practices. So I'm about to blow your mind because we are going to talk about the first piece of legislation that's already happened for 2021. And that is the 424 Transfer Exception Expansion, otherwise known as Non-Controversial Legislation 2021-1. As the title suggests, this legislation deals with transfer exceptions for 424 transfer student athletes. So we're going to start way at the beginning. And what I mean by that is we're going to start at the base bylaw for 2-year transfers. And here it is. If a student athlete transfers to your school from a 2-year school, they must sit an academic year in residence before they can participate for you. This is the same for everyone. That's what bylaw 1454 says. But don't worry, as there usually are, there are a lot of exceptions. You can find those in bylaw 14541 and on this following slide. So previously, there were 3 transfer exceptions that would allow a student athlete who came to your school from a 2-year school to be immediately eligible. No year in residence required. So the first one was if they had never practiced or competed in intercollegiate athletics. Good to go. The second one was if they had never previously attended a 4-year school, they had only attended a 2-year school, they could be immediately eligible if they would have been academically and athletically eligible had they remained at the 2-year school they came from. And the third exception was for student athletes who have previously attended a 4-year school. That's the definition of a 424 transfer. If they've gone to a 4-year school, then they went to a 2-year institution, and now they're at your school, the 424 transfer. They could be immediately eligible at your school in one of 2 ways. The first way is if they had remained at their first year 4-year institution, they would have been academically and athletically eligible. That's that top part. Or if they didn't leave that first 4-year academically and athletically eligible, they attended their 2-year institution for at least 2 full-time semesters or 3 full-time quarters. And during that time, they successfully completed at least 24 semester or 36 quarter hours of credit. And so for the purposes of this transfer exception expansion that we're talking about today, we are only concerned with the second part of that 424 transfer exception, the part that fits nicely into that red box. And we're going to take a closer look at that red box. So to be immediately eligible at your school, a 2-year college transfer who left their first 4-year school inelibly would have had to attend the 2-year for at least 2 full-time semesters or 3 full-time quarters where they're bringing with them at least 24 semester or 36 quarter hours of credit. So as a staff, we started to see more and more cases of these sort of student athletes that weren't meeting this exception. They left their first 4-year inelibly, they didn't spend 2 full-time semesters at the 2-year school. And there's a couple of issues we saw popping up. Some of them graduated with their associate's degree after 1 semester, so there was really no reason for them to stay at the 2-year any longer. For some, it was another reason entirely. And then we were asking the question, well, what is the option for these student athletes? And if you remember a couple of slides ago, the answer to that question is that student athlete was going to have to sit an academic year in residence once they got to your school.
Corey, we've got one in, and it says for a 424 transfer, if the student athlete was not athletically and academically eligible at the prior 4-year, would a summer term count as a full-time term for the exception?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we get this one quite often, actually. And so for purposes of satisfying a academic year in residence, summer terms are not counted. They wouldn't be able to count as one of those full-time semesters. Just the traditional normal fall, spring terms are what we're looking for. So even if a student athlete were to take 12, 15 more credits over a summer period, it's not going to help them out to satisfy one of those full-time terms. So what we've all been waiting for, enter non-controversial legislation 2021-1. So this expands the exceptions that we just went through for those 424 transfer student athletes who leave their original 4-year inelibly and who did not spend the 2 full-time semesters or the 3 full-time quarters at their 2-year institution before they arrived on your campus. So what the expansion does is one of those required semesters or up to 2 of the required quarters to meet the transfer exception can now take place at the certifying institution, which is your institution. So as a result, the student athletes will take whatever time they had at the 2-year, combine that with either 1 full-time term or 2 full-time quarters at your institution, and they will have served the equivalent of the academic year in residence, and then they would be able to compete for you. And so this is kind of an added bonus because that transfer student athlete gets to come to your school, and while they're not participating, they are acclimating to the new academic environment, and they are able to demonstrate their ability to succeed at the Division III level before they even need to worry about playing for you. So just to really nail down this point, I wanted to circle back to what all of the 424 options are now that we have this transfer exception expansion, and they're here. So to really just sum it up, here are the current exceptions that allow a 424 transfer student athlete to be eligible immediately at your institution, well, not immediately necessarily, but to be eligible at your institution. The first on the left is they left their first 4-year school academically and athletically eligible. The middle one is the one that was in the red box. They attended the 2-year school for at least 2 full-time semesters or 3 full-time quarters, and they're bringing with them at least 24 semester or 36 quarter hours of credit. And then now, as a result of this non-controversial legislation, they attended at least 2 semesters or 3 quarters between the 2-year college and your institution, where they're also earning that 24 semester or 36 quarter hours of credit. So it was a mouthful, but again, wanted to show you what it looks like in LSDBI. If you type in the search bar NC 2021-1, that proposal is up and ready for you to check out. And we are going to cruise right along into my last item for today is the April 24th, 2020 staff interpretation. You find interpretations within LSDBI, and sometimes staff will even attach them to the answers that you get back within the RSRO system. And they're the result of staff or Division III committee recommendations, and the point of these sort of interpretations is to provide clarity for all of you as the membership when you're trying to apply legislation on your campus. And so here's what it said. This staff interpretation was issued in order to clarify the privacy restrictions and the timeline surrounding the use of video conferencing in the recruiting process. And so specifically, the interpretation confirms that video conferences like Google Hangouts or FaceTime or Zoom or Skype or whatever the platform may be are subject to the same sorts of privacy limitations as other electronic transmissions. So think your emails, your social media, all of that. So therefore, if a video conference contains multiple prospective student athletes, multiple recruits, it's only permissible if it occurs after May 1st and all of the PSAs that may be on that video conference are seniors who have submitted their financial deposit to your institution. And so I know this may sound a little bit confusing, especially if you've been paying attention to the bylaw 13 COVID flexibility that's come out this spring. And coupled with the fact that this interp came out in April, it may have contributed to some of that confusion, but it's important to note that this interpretation is not actually COVID related. It just clarifies the legislation that existed before COVID even happened, and it clarifies how things are going to be interpreted once COVID is finally behind us. So keep that in mind. Keep it in the back of your mind that this staff interpretation doesn't actually butt heads with what's happening as a result of COVID.
I'm going to leave this to you and Bill. I know this has been addressed on other calls, but we're getting the question again, so I wanted to put it out there about incoming first-year students being allowed to participate in virtual team meetings if they've submitted their enrollment deposit and it's after May 1st. So yes, rationale for that or why they aren't and any limits that apply in that space.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. It's like Tiff said, it's one we're continuing to get. I think this is a great time to ask it because you may see this staff interpretation right now and say, hey, doesn't that mean that all of these deposited recruits can now join the team meetings? And the answer is that it doesn't. So this staff interpretation lives within bylaw 13, right? It's all about the public communication that you can have with recruits, with prospective student athletes. It's saying that if it's before May 1st and a prospect senior year in deposit, whatever video conferences you're using, that has to be one-on-one, coach and recruit only. This interp says after May 1st and a financial deposit, then you can have video conferences with multiple recruits and the coach on it. It doesn't give you flexibility to have enrolled student athletes on those video conferences. That flexibility is all, that lives in bylaw 17. And there's no kind of overlap here because the recruits that get the flexibility in 13 can't be certified as student athletes to also get flexibility in 17. So that's why right now, the way that the COVID relief stands, that deposited PSAs, deposited recruits cannot take place in more than that one team meeting that's in conjunction with a visit because, as all of you know, a visit is also in the bylaw 13 space. It's not in the bylaw 17 space.
And so this next question is a little bit of a hybrid, and again, this was going to require additional rationale. So Corey, Bill, anybody who wants to chime in on this one, why can PSAs participate in fundraisers but not team meetings?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer to that question is that's just what the current legislation allows and does not allow. Whether or not you, as the membership, agree with that, that's certainly up for discussion. That's kind of what, you know, the whole legislative process is all about. If all of you want to change something, then that's certainly in your purview. But as staff, we're just interpreting the bylaws the way they're currently written. And then obviously now during all of this COVID-ness, interpreting the bylaws and the flexibility that the different committees are giving us. And under the current flexibility, that's just not permitted.
Yeah, Tiffany, it's Bill, and just to confirm what Corey said, the only reason the PSAs can do it is because there's a specific exception that was enacted through legislation. Otherwise, they would not be able to do that. So it was they were prohibited until an exception was adopted by the membership that now allows them to do that. So that is the only reason, as Corey suggested, that is permissible.
Someone asked if we knew about any membership proposals kind of looking ahead in 2021 for the 2021 convention. And if we are in a position, and we very well may not be, to just kind of provide a preview of any of those anticipated proposals.
Yeah, Corey, I'll step in. So right now, the membership has up until July 15th to submit any legislative proposals. To date, we have not received any proposals from the membership for the 2020 convention. Obviously, one of the big legislative items that we anticipate for the convention coming up would be name, image, and likeness.
Great, thank you, Bill. I think one more thing, and again, you guys kind of hit on this, but it's being asked again, with high schools ending their school year, can we review this interpretation? And I think that this means PSAs being involved in team meetings because they are in limbo and not going back to high school and not being able to be on team calls and feel included.
Yeah, so I'll step in to So this issue of can PSAs attend virtual team meetings during this particular season because of COVID, obviously knowing in the future virtual team meetings will not be permissible next summer, potentially, and institutions currently could meet with PSAs together based on that interp. We are asking the governance bodies to take a look at this specific issue over the next several weeks to see if any type of waiver relief would be appropriate that would allow prospective student athletes to engage in team meetings with student athletes. So it's something that the governance committees will begin looking at over the next several weeks.
The other question, I think, yeah, are virtual team meetings being defined as both current student athletes and deposited student athletes?
No. The virtual team meetings are with student athletes. PSAs are not student athletes until they attend practice or attend the first day of classes. Or attend practice, and then they're not students in the institution until they attend the institution. So they are not considered as part of the virtual team meeting.
Yeah, and I think I would just add on to that, a virtual team meeting is a meeting where the enrolled student athletes are there. That's what Bill said. This staff interpretation that's up there, coaches can engage in video conferences with multiple PSAs after May 1st and after they've all deposited. That's what this interp says. There just can't also be enrolled student athletes on that video conference because that would then make it a team meeting. So I think that's important to remember. Thank you everyone again. Have a great afternoon and evening, and hope you all continue to stay safe out there.